Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. Does American President Donald Trump really see the Russian war against Ukraine at least partly differently compared to, for example, 6 months ago when he was still regularly berating Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky? This was my question for a military analyst, Franz Stefan Gadi. His response? I think the major mistake that we are making in Europe is constantly trying to assess what Trump is thinking about this or that. What we need to do is to get a clear understanding of what Ukraine really means for us. Franz said to me, does he think that the US will provide Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine? How does he see the situation on the battlefield? And why does he say that Trump wants to hand over the war to the Europeans? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Franz, I have to say that I'm surprised that after almost 4 years of full-scale Russian war against Ukraine, someone is still willing to say that a single weapon system can essentially change everything on the battlefield. But it seems that we suddenly have this conversation again. This time it's about Tomahawk missiles. Frankly, I doubt that the Trump's administration will ship this weapon system to Kiev. But in theory, what advantage could Tomahawk missiles provide for Ukraine, and what are the limitations?
You need to assess how realistic this really is in terms of timelines. As a matter of fact, the United States can't really send Tomahawk missiles right away to Ukraine because it doesn't really have proper launch platforms for these weapon systems to launch them from the ground. So you would need to come up essentially with a new launch system for these Tomahawk missiles fairly quickly. So I think there are technical issues that need to be resolved first. That's just one example. There are a couple of others. The second issue is the quantity. What's the quantity of missiles that the United States would be willing to send to Ukraine? And here the challenge is that U.S. arsenals, based on discussions that I've had with U.S. sources on the subject, are fairly depleted. And there's a clear trend within the present U.S. administration, particularly among certain decision makers in the Pentagon, to withhold or at least to slow down deliveries to Ukraine of weapon systems that could potentially be used or would be necessary to either deter or fight China in East Asia in the event of a larger scale conflict. So I'm frankly deeply skeptical about Tomahawk ever becoming a fact on the battlefield in Eastern Europe. And frankly speaking, I don't really see that Tomahawk missiles would be able to provide that much of an additional capability in comparison to what Ukraine has been doing in terms of its long-range strikes.
That's so.
It would be an incremental increase, frankly, in combat capability. It certainly would increase pressure on Russia in many ways, but there are two things that I think you need to consider. First, again, the quantity of missiles that would be supplied. And secondly, what it would really do to Russia's overall perceptions of the United States' role in this conflict. And what you always need to keep in the back of your head is the nuclear dimension here. I find it highly unlikely that the United States would do something that would in any case threaten the integrity of the Russian nuclear deterrent. To be honest, I don't see the United States really willing to get involved more deeply in the Ukraine conflict, which would certainly happen with the delivery of Tomahawks. On the contrary, I'm deeply still convinced that despite what you're reading in the papers, the United States actually wants to hand over this conflict to Europe and wants Europe to pay for it and wants Europe also to take the risk. So frankly, how I interpret this story, first and foremost, is as a negotiation tactic by the United States, leaking it to the press essentially that the United States would be willing to deliver these capabilities, along with press leaks on the United States willing to provide ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, data for deep strikes into Russian territory. I think it's just to get Russia to the negotiation table. And for me, it's an expression of President Trump's frustration with President Putin that he hasn't been able to make any headway in negotiations or at least agreeing to a temporary ceasefire. So frankly, I'm not so sure that we will still be talking about Tomahawk missiles a few weeks down the road from now.
Yeah, I very much agree, in fact. But when you said that this might be a part of a negotiation tactic, could it work?
It could potentially work. I do think that there's something to be said about negotiations with the Russians, with Vladimir Putin. From a position of strength, I think you can achieve much better results with the Russians. Now, that's sort of an axiom that has been true for many years, decades, and so forth, up to a point, of course, always. There are other important considerations here, but I do think that it could potentially strengthen the US negotiation position. But in order to do that, you have to be consistent. And I think the major issue here is, again, that you're going to have a 48-hour news cycle around this, and then there's going to be little follow-up, perhaps by the Trump administration. And I think Putin is just going to sit back, or is going to sit back and just wait and essentially tell Trump, okay, well, show me your cards here, right? What are you really willing to do? And again, I find it highly implausible that the Trump administration will greenlight the delivery of Tomahawk missiles. I might be wrong, but I just generally think that's not going to be the case. So I think it's a hypothetical discussion and not something that I think we'll be talking about in next couple of weeks.
Franz, you mentioned a couple of things, so let's dive a bit deeper in it. How would you describe the current approach of the Trump administration toward Ukraine? Do you think that Donald Trump really sees the war at least partly differently compared to, for example, 6 months ago when he was still regularly berating his Ukrainian President Zelensky? And if he sees it differently, does it have any practical effect for Ukraine?
Look, first off, I think he's not going to be thinking that much about the conflict overall, to be honest. He has other concerns. I would say that it's unclear. And I think the major issue or the major mistake that we are making in Europe is constantly trying to assess what Trump is thinking about this or that. And by doing that, we sort of are not doing our homework ourselves. And what we need to do, and I've said this multiple times now, is to get a clear understanding what Ukraine really means for us, whether it is really generally part of Europe's security architecture, or at least Western Europe's, or whatever you want to call the European Union's, NATO Europe's security architecture. Are we willing to integrate Ukraine or not? Is Ukraine going to be a perpetual border state, so to speak, caught in between Russia and the rest of Europe? Is Ukraine going to turn into some version of Israel as a result, right? Where we are going to re-arm it, we, that is NATO and the European Union, with American weapons in part, but paid by the Europeans. And what are we really willing to risk with regard to maintaining a sovereign, independent Ukraine, independent from Russian influence? And I think we haven't really agreed on any of these fundamental questions, to be honest, right? I mean, we are still waiting for the green light from the Trump administration. We're essentially still trying to get the United States support, and we're willing to do anything that we can in order not to really become an independent strategic actor in all of this. And it just fundamentally underlines this dependency that we all feel on the United States in many ways, which is a dependency by design and really by a willingness of the Europeans to give up. And it's also, the United States has been the glue that has been holding together this European project to a certain degree at NATO. But we have to be also clear that it camouflages deep disagreements within Europe about Ukraine's role in any sort of pro-NATO, pro-European Union security architecture, right? And so I think we need to do our homework first. And that's what I fear we don't do if we continue to ask whether Trump's approach to Ukraine has changed. And my short answer there is no, I haven't seen any indication that it has changed. I think a lot of it is negotiation tactic. A lot of it has to do with the fact that he meets with someone and he takes the advice of the last person in the room. But there are certain constants. And the constant, again, is, and I emphasize this again here, Trump wants to hand over the Ukrainian war to the Europeans and has done so already to a certain degree.
I will come back to the role of Europe in all of this, but let's talk a bit also about the situation on the battlefield. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Alexander Syrskyi, said that Russian spring and summer offensives have failed to meet their goals. Do you agree or not? And what are the current Russian goals?
First of all, I have an issue with how this is framed, and I've said that also a few times already. I just don't see a Russian summer offensive. The framing for me is actually quite important here. I really see it as a continuum of offensive operations that started sometime in March and that are going to continue into the fall. So I think it gives the wrong picture that the Russians have launched like a larger scale offensive over the summer and that offensive failed. What's clear is that the tempo of operations along certain axes in southern Donetsk and in other parts of the front line has slowed down. But I also think that what we've seen over the last couple of weeks was also a clever Ukrainian information warfare campaign that is also not really giving you a good understanding of what's actually happening on the battlefield, and that the situation is still critical along many sectors of the front line. It's unlikely, and I always said that the Russians are going to achieve an operational breakthrough, but Ukrainian forces remain stretched. They've done, I think, much better than I would have anticipated only a couple of months ago. But still, I think the danger is far from over, and it's unclear to me what the Ukrainian theory of success is going to be. And we're approaching winter, moving away from the front line. I think what's much more important over the winter months will be the character of Russia's strategic airstrike campaign against Ukrainian critical infrastructure and how this is going to impact Ukraine's defense industry, how this is going to impact morale, and how this is going to impact perceptions in the West about whether Ukraine can endure this for another year. So there are a couple of critical considerations here away from the battlefield. I do have to say that I don't expect the larger scale operational breakthroughs over the next couple of months by the Russians, and Russians certainly have not achieved their objectives. That is for sure. Pokrovsk is still in Ukrainian hands. All the other major towns like Konstantinovka remains in Ukrainian hands. Yeah, Russians have not made any headway, which, by the way, I also think is the reason why we're seeing an uptick in what you would call a gray zone or hybrid warfare operations by the Russians in Europe. I think there's a direct linkage between lack of success on the front line and increasing hybrid warfare methods, particularly among countries like Estonia, Denmark, Poland, who are actively supporting Ukraine or are hosting important facilities for supporting the Ukrainians against this Russian war of aggression. So I think it's all related to a certain degree.
You mentioned that you think now that the Ukrainian troops were more successful in defending the territory than you anticipated. Why is that so? Why do you think they're more successful?
My assessment a couple of months ago was really dependent on this slipping advantage that Ukraine maintained in drone warfare. And I was concerned that Russia would be much more successful in terms of establishing superiority along select axes of advance in drone warfare, and that would lead to a more systematic collapse of the Ukrainian defense system, which is essentially built upon or as its foundation superiority in drone warfare in order to compensate for Russian superiority in manpower and material. And I was afraid that this might collapse and lead to the collapse of the Ukrainian system. And then you could have cascading effects as a result. And that has not materialized so far. I think Ukrainians are still maintaining, parity. They have lost the advantage on some axes of advance against the Russians in drone warfare, but I don't see a systematic collapse of Ukrainian drone defenses. And there's an adaptation and counter-adaptation game ongoing where interceptor drones, for example, on the Ukrainian side are increasingly playing an important role. And it seems to me that the Ukrainians have been able to deploy more interceptor drones and have been also better at organizing essentially drone defenses to beat back that Russian advance in drone warfare. It's not over. It remains to be seen whether this situation can endure. And what is clear is that the Russians have certainly improved their drone warfare approaches over the last couple of months. But the minus for the Russian forces here is that the quality of infantry, the quality of ground forces has dramatically decreased because of losses, lack of training, and so forth. There's also, exhaustion on the Russian side, not just on the Ukrainian side. So it's these different variables, these different inputs that you have to weigh as a military analyst, which makes it very difficult sometimes to come up with a clear understanding of the situation and a clear conclusion, right? I mean, I work mostly with hypotheses and fairly limited data sets in that sense. And I do think there's a certain like a fog of war, as Clausewitz would put it, on a lot of these operations. And we just need to wait and see how this is going to unfold.
What about Ukrainian strikes against oil refineries and so on? How do you assess it? Is it successful?
I think it has been more successful than in the past. I think it certainly puts additional pressure on the Russian system as a whole. Will it be decisive? No, I don't think so. Is it good for information warfare purposes? Of course. Is it bad for the Russian economy to a certain degree? Yes, of course. Does it hurt Russia? Yes. Does it hurt Russia to a degree that it will slow down combat operations in Ukraine? I don't think so. Not for the time being. And I think that's all I can say about this.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about Europe, like 2-3 questions, and I will finish with this. In August, you wrote for the Financial Times, if EU leaders genuinely believe Kiev's independence matters, they must deploy combat troops to guarantee any ceasefire. But there is no ceasefire, and I believe there is a deep reluctance to send combat troops to Ukraine. So what do you make out of this?
Yeah, so I think it's clear at this stage that Europeans, neither the Brits, the French, especially not the German, not even mentioning the Poles, have no appetite for deploying any sort of force to Ukraine in the near term. And no European country is willing to go to war against Russia over Ukraine. I think that much is also clear. That's okay. If that's the position, that's fine. But I don't think these debates are very useful in many ways because they are diverting from, I think, more useful pursuits, such as trying to more actively support Ukraine, seize Russian assets, for example, right? There was a huge discussion about this. Use that money to essentially prop up the Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian armed forces, and perhaps don't give the illusion that Europe is willing to do something and then, backing out in the last minute, which is, I think, sort of the impression that you get from this. Having said all this, I think, and I said this also before, it seems likely that after the agreement of a ceasefire, there might be a presence of European forces in training capacity, maybe in Western Ukraine, or an increased training capacity set up in Poland. But I don't think we are going to see European combat troops deployed to Ukraine. And I think it's a discussion, again, that was mostly started or kicked off by Paris and London in order to get Trump or the US administration engaged in the Ukraine question. So it didn't have anything to do with Ukraine itself in terms of propping up Ukrainian defense capabilities and capacity to withstand renewed Russian aggression up a ceasefire is agreed to, and much more to do with just essentially pleasing the Trump administration that the Europeans are doing something. And I think we massively scored an own goal in this endeavor. And we certainly have lost credibility. But frankly, all the people that I've discussed this with political decision makers in Europe, particularly German decision makers and politicians, have told me in private that this is illusionary, that they don't really see German troops in Ukraine.
You mentioned that already, but how do you assess the drone and jets incidents in Poland, Estonia, or Denmark? Is Russia deliberately testing EU defenses, and what should be the European reaction? And of course, this is a very simplistic journalistic question, but could Europeans potentially shoot down Russian jets?
I mean, look, I think there should never be like a blanco check, right? A carte blanche or anything to shoot down Russian aircraft. And I think the people who are saying that are irresponsible, and I think it's merely rhetoric. And a lot of these states also are, frankly, not up to the task themselves. So if they don't have the capability to do it themselves, it's sort of an empty gesture in many ways. So first off, I think, as I said, it is related to what's happening in Ukraine and the lack of Russian progress on the battlefield. Second, I think it's certainly meant to test NATO's resolve and above all, NATO's and the European Union's unity, right? And the rule here is very simple. Smaller incidences below, the threshold of open armed conflict are much harder to respond to and create much more divisiveness among policymakers, among different European states than larger scale events like Ukraine. What Europe needs to do is, on the one hand, establish a certain amount of resiliency. That is, prop up drone defenses and so forth, tracking capabilities and all of that. And I think we can do that, right? That's for sure. On the other hand, we need to have a clear understanding what our response would be. And I think the response has to be measured and has to be contingent on the situation. If it's like in the case of the MiG-31 entering NATO airspace for a couple of minutes, if they would have been fitted with gravity bombs or ground-to-air missiles, then it would have been a different story than with what they were actually armed with, which was, at least from my understanding, air-to-air missiles. They did not pose a threat to any ground target. Still dangerous, of course, and still a violation, and it still mandates a response, but I'm not so sure that it would have mandated shooting down these aircraft, especially since they were closely monitored in any case by NATO aircraft, so they couldn't have done anything to begin with. So, as I said, I'm against like a blank check. I think what we also need to do, though, is raise awareness among the European population that this is actually a threat, this is happening, a lot of it is actually coming from Russia, and that we are in that gray zone between war and peace when it comes to our relationship with Russia. And that's going to stay for a while. And Russia is going to test us. Russia is going to try to saw discord, conduct information warfare operations, cyber attacks, right? Shut down airports and all of this. It's deliberate. And we need to be able to live with it. And also, on occasion, I think we need to retaliate, whether that's in cyberspace, whether that's through some indirect measures, additional sanctions and so forth. It doesn't necessarily need to be militarily that we are responding. And it needs to be proportionate, frankly, to the threat.
Friends, and to wrap it up, what about the drone war that was discussed at the informal EU summit in Copenhagen? According to media reports, France and Germany expressed skepticism, especially if the project will be managed by the European Commission. Southern countries are pushing for a broader concept that will also protect their borders. So it looks like a typical EU process, and I'm a big fan of the EU, but it's sometimes very slow and too bureaucratic. Do you think that the drone war, or however we call it, can be a realistic project? And how would you envision it?
I don't think we need to spend too much time on that. Let's see what really will happen. And I think first and foremost, countries at the national level need to increase their counter-drone defenses. And what you can say from a pure military analytical perspective is that you need layered defenses, you need a wide sensor network that can pick up drones, that can share data over networks fairly quickly. You need an integrated sensor network linked also to potential shooters, that is, for example, interceptor drones, point defenses, other means to intercept drones with, for example, electronic warfare capabilities. And yeah, I mean, the European Commission can certainly act as a coordinator. I don't necessarily see why that would need to be the case. Let's see what this project is really going to turn into. I think it could act as a catalyst. And I think it's also, frankly, part of raising the awareness that this is actually a threat. So in many ways, I also see it as a public relations endeavor or enterprise to get the European population at large to take a closer look at this emanating threat from Russia. But let's see. I'm also skeptical. I don't necessarily see a role for the European Union in this from a technical or like implementation perspective. But yeah, let's wait and see.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.